We have the capacity to make less than 2% of the world's lithium-ion batteries. Less than 2%. In the next 5 years, on the trajectory that we're now on, we're going to be able to make 40% of the advanced batteries right here in the United States of America. Right here. So the next time somebody asks you when you're at the grocery store, well, what does this Recovery Act do? You can tell them. One of the things it helped do is to expand and catalyze an entire new industry where the United States of America can gain enormous market share across the globe. And that's the kind of strategy we need, helping the private sector thrive in entirely new industries, the industries of the future. It's a strategy that will not only create jobs in the near term, but also sustained growth and opportunity in the long run. Now, this has been a harrowing time for our country. And it's easy to grow cynical and wonder if America's best days are behind us, especially after such a terrible crisis. And we've seen folks in Washington trying to play the usual politics with the crisis. And that's not surprising, of course. That's how Washington works. Although I do think it's important for the American people to remember the failed economic policies that got us into this mess, just so we make sure we don't return to them. But what we can see here at this plant is that the worst of the storm is over. The brighter days are still ahead. In Charlotte and all across the country, we can see the promise and possibility that awaits us if we tap our ingenuity and our inventiveness, our skill and our drive as a people. If we're smart, if we're willing to do what it takes, we can lead in new industries and create new jobs and strengthen the middle class and achieve a shared and lasting prosperity. And we can turn this turmoil into recovery and emerge stronger than before. I'm convinced that's what we're called to do. I'm confident that that is what we will do. And I want to say to all the employees here at Celgard, we are proud of you because you're helping to point the way and helping to lead not just here in North Carolina, but all across the country. So thank you very much, everybody. Let me take some questions from you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So, you know, when they let me out of my cage at the White House, I like to actually have a chance to talk to folks. And so we've got time for a few questions. And we've got some young people here in the audience with their microphones. This is not formal, even though I'm sure with some of the cameras, a few of you may feel it's a little intimidating. All you got to do is raise your hand. We'll call on you. And it can be a question about anything. If you can introduce yourself, though, that's helpful so everybody knows who's speaking. And we'll start with that young lady right there since you're right next to the mic.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Dakin. I'm here from Charlotte. I'm part of the Polypore parent company. My question is regarding the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. And many people have commented on the fact that it has come at a great cost to many public organizations, the fact that we need to assess and report on our internal controls over financial reporting. It's also come, many say, without value in the recent financial crisis. What value do you think it may have going forward on the upswing as the economy goes forward?
Well, it's a great question. For those of you who aren't aware of it, Sarbanes-Oxley was instituted not in response to this financial crisis, but in response to the Enron WorldCom nonsense that took place over a decade ago. And the concern there was that the accounting practices of companies had gotten so out of whack that you had a company like Enron that was essentially booking all these profits, driving up their stock really high. CEOs were making these gazillion-dollar bonuses, but it turned out when you actually got in there and started looking at what they were doing, they were building a house of cards. It was manufacturing profits out of thin air. And so the concern was, how do we make sure that CEOs and their boards of directors are more accountable to the reporting that they're doing, so that investors, shareholders, the market, customers, suppliers, and employees, a lot of whom had gotten tricked into putting all their savings into a company like Enron, and then it turned out that everything they thought they had been saving just went up in a cloud of smoke, that all those folks would be protected. So the intent around Sarbanes-Oxley was a good idea. It was the right thing to do. There have been, I think, some legitimate criticisms about the fact that although Sarbanes-Oxley is a relatively modest cost for a very big company, it can be a very significant cost for a mid-sized or a small company. Because if they have to abide by all the rules and all the regulations and all the double checking and triple checking and quadruple checking, and so they've got to hire a whole bunch of accountants. It's one thing if you're, a Fortune 100 company that's got several $billion in revenue to spend a couple $1 million on accountants. It's another thing if you are a company that is making $100 million a year and you're spending a couple $1 million on accountants. That's suddenly that could be the difference in terms of your profit margin. So what we're interested in doing is to work with companies to get advice. Are there ways that we can streamline and make this more effective? Are there ways that we can lessen the burden on small and medium-sized companies, but still retain the basic principle that accounting standards have to be met, they have to be clear, they have to be understandable, you can't cook the books, and that CEOs and boards of directors have to be accountable for the accounting statements that they put out there. And they've got to sign a bottom line, and they're going to be directly liable if for some reason it turns out that there were some shenanigans going on there. So this raises a broader question about regulation. We went through a period of time where I think the general theory was the less regulation, the better. And if you talk to most companies, they'd rather not have any regulations whatsoever. There's nothing wrong with that. That's just the nature of it. You figure companies think they're pretty smart. They know what they're doing. And I'm sure if I talked to Bob, he'd say, there are a whole bunch of things that I've got to do that I wish I didn't have to do. But it's like any other law. You put the laws in place, even though most folks are following the rules and operating decently in common sense, to make sure that those folks who aren't operating that way can't wreak havoc on the system. And so we're going to be having a big debate when it comes to financial regulatory reform. You're seeing the same pattern come up right now. You essentially had a whole bunch of financial institutions, investment banks like Lehman Brothers, who were taking $1 and they were able to leverage, essentially use that dollar to make a $60 bet on subprime loans in housing, and take huge exorbitant risks that almost brought the entire system to heel. And all your friends and neighbors and communities are paying the price because nobody was minding the store and making sure that these banks and these financial institutions were following basic rules of the road. So what we've now said is, look, we've got to have a financial system that works. That's how credit flows. That's how businesses finance themselves. But we've got to have some basic rules to make sure that we never find ourselves in a situation again where we've got two choices. Either you bail out the banks, in which case you're thinking, why am I propping up these folks who caused the problems in the first place? Or you don't, but then these banks start failing and the whole system breaks down, creating what could have been a Great Depression. We can't allow ourselves to be put in that position again. So we've got to have some basic rules some basic regulations at the front end that say to banks, we're not going to let you get too big to fail. We're not going to put ourselves in a position where somehow you're able to gamble with other people's money in such a way that it can potentially bring down the whole system. Getting the balance right, how to do that, is something that you've got to be very careful about. But I think now that we're starting to see a framework emerge, both in the House of Representatives and in the Senate, where my hope is that we can actually get this done sometime in the next several weeks. Thank you for the great question. This gentleman.